our series of seminar in solidarity with Ukraine. Today we have actually Dr. Mathilde Muñoz. Yeah, she defended her thesis on Monday. Yeah, and so we can basically be the first one of, hopefully the first one to call her as a doctor. So Dr. Mathilde Muñoz, welcome to this seminar. So Mathilde defended her thesis at the Paris School of Economics, and currently she is a postdoc in Berkeley, and she will join the faculty basically next year. Mathilde research is focusing on redistributive implications of cross-border labor mobility and trade in services. Mathilde is a winner of International Institute for Public Finance Young Economist Award in 2019. And she's just back from the Ristad tour where she presented her job market paper. Probably Mathilde presented her paper many times, but still interesting to see. This afternoon she'll be speaking on tax competition in services. Actually, when I've seen the title of the paper first time, I was really excited because it's quite close to the problems that we are discussing in Ukraine in particular. So this is really a applied topic, and I'm really thrilled to hear the insights from Mathilde. So the structure of today's seminar is the following. We have an hour for presentation and for the questions. If there are any kind of slight question, clarification needed, please jump in, raise your hand, and try to ask this question or clarification. But if there are some heavier questions, I would like you to leave it until the end of the presentation so that we can discuss it after Mathilde presents her paper completely. So Mathilde, the screen is yours. Please share your insights and paper.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Oleg, for this very generous introduction. And thank you for everyone for having me. It feels very weird to be presenting on Zoom again. I think it reminds me of the job market, but not the job market is gone. And what I'm going to present today is not my job market paper. It is a new paper about tax competition and the geography of trade in services. So I think the broad motivation of this paper really is about the fact, or this idea we have as economists, that tax differentials matter for the location of firms and the location of activity. And this has been a very important topic for international discussion on taxes. But those discussions we are having on whether we want or not to compete in order to attract firms and to attract workers has been focused mostly on minimum rates and on taxation on capital, in particular profit. So the way we think about it today is really that capital is highly mobile, and the way countries compete in terms of tax rates is mostly focused on corporate taxation, not so much labor taxation. However, with this recent surge of remote work with the COVID crisis, we actually had to face novel questions and challenges for labor taxation, not corporate taxation. So in a way, when people work or formally employed in one country, but can work remotely in another country, we are not very sure of what labor taxes or rules should apply to workers. And the way we decide on those international tax rules, when we have some distortion between the countries where people are formally employed and where they effectively work, can actually shape the spatial allocation of economic activity, but also export or international trade. So what I'm going to try to do in this paper is to use a European policy in order to study how labor tax competition can shape cross-border allocation of services and international trade. So what I'm going to be doing today in this paper is to use this European passing policy I've been studying in my job market paper as well, that allow firms to send their employees abroad to supply services locally. So as in remote work, in a way, people are formally employed in one country, but they are effectively producing their work or their service in another country. And what is nice about this policy is that it creates very interesting tax variations that we can actually measure at the origin and destination level in a way mimicking the effect of tariffs that we have for goods, but for services. And so using those variations, I'll try to understand our international tax rules on labor, not on goods or on profit, can jointly affect trade and mobility of people and shape the geography of economic activity in the world, basically. So in order for you to understand what is it that I'm going to be estimating in this paper and how does it relate to what other people have been thinking in the literature, I want to jump in the second slide directly to the contribution to the literature. And I think, so what I'm going to be doing today is basically try to estimate this parameter, what we call an elasticity of how much geography of services or trade change when we change labor tax competition, basically. And this parameter is related to 4 strands of literature that I'm going to be discussing now. The first contribution of the paper is to contribute to this literature that has been trying to understand how trade can respond to variation in cost. And usually the way people think about trade responsiveness to cost is by thinking about trade tariffs. So we typically think about trade in goods, and we use shocks in trade tariffs in order to understand how much the trade between countries change when we change trade tariffs. So what I'm going to provide today in this paper is the first evidence of an estimate of the elasticity of trade in services. And as services represent today more than 80% of value added in production, I do believe that this parameter is very interesting and important for economists in order to understand whether responsiveness to changes in cost in services sectors is different compared to trade in goods. Now, related to my previous slides, there is also this literature that is not so much only about trade, but is merely speaking about the tax competition effect of the geography of economic activity. And typically, as I was saying, this literature is mostly focused on either within country mobility, thinking about taxes and spatial misallocation within a given country, or on tax competition in terms of corporate tax rates, trying to understand how the fact that people tax profit differently can attract more or less firms in different countries. So what I try to do today in this paper will provide evidence on the fact that the way we agree not only on taxes on profit, but also on labor can shape the location of firms that supply services and therefore matters in order to understand the overall geography of economic activity. The third contribution of the paper is to provide the first direct evidence of the effect of labor tax competition on trade. So typically, we know a lot about how trade tariffs, as I was saying, change exports of trading goods, but there is very little evidence on how national policy and in terms of taxes and labor market regulation can actually matter for the comparative advantages of countries in trade. And so far, we only had very, very little evidence focused on either minimum wages in China. Like that's the best evidence we have. So what I will show you today is that I can use this policy in order to show that trade flows are not merely explained by differences in productivity. They are also affected by the way countries set their wages, set their labor market regulation, and set their taxes nationally. And therefore, labor tax competition can matter to understand export and imports of services between countries. And finally, the last contribution of this paper, or this elasticity I will be estimating, relates to this broad literature that I've been trying to understand how people move in response to taxes. And so far, this literature I've been working on myself has been focused on top earners only. And so what I'll try to do today will show you that there is a novel margin of mobility responses to taxes that is intermediated by firms, meaning that firms can actually locate in one country and then send some workers abroad, and they also react to taxes through this mobility of people. So that will kind of expand the way we think about those international migration responses to taxes in the literature. All right, so if you don't have any question, I'll move on with the talk. I'll start by giving you a summary of the institutional framework I'll be using in the paper and the data I'll use for my estimation. Then I'll move to a simple theoretical framework where I will explain what is conceptually the effect we expect from labor tax competition for the geography of trade in services and of economic activity in those sectors. And then I'll take this model to the data by showing you an estimate of responses to taxes through posting in two successive ways. First, I'll show you reduced form evidence of trade migration responses to taxes, and then I'll show you that I can estimate this parameter in a more structural way, really taking the theory to the data, thanks to some trade tools. All right.
Mathilde, may I just a clarifying question? Maybe you can just give at least for me a couple of examples of trading services, okay? So that get an applicable verge of this study.
Yeah. So here, and perhaps I'll give you some descriptive statistics later on. But the type of services sectors I'm going to be talking today are supplied locally, so they tend to be manual services. So you can think about transport, construction, maintenance, anything that needs to be supplied locally, cleaning, driving, and so forth. So in the type of services I'll be studying today, actually, that are traded through this policy in Europe, you have roughly 70% of people that move in order to supply the services that are blue-collar workers. So those tends to be services where blue-collar manual workers are overrepresented. And 30% of those services are going to be construction, 20% are going to be transport sectors, and roughly 10% are going to be agricultural services, and so forth.
So basically, there is a firm, let's say in Poland, right, that employs people over there and sends abroad, I don't know, to Germany, to Netherlands, to do some service work, right?
Exactly.
Basically,
and try to exploit those flows as a very nice way to both measure trading services, but also to measure what is the cost that is linked to tax differentials between those two countries, which is usually something you cannot really do with standard trading services measures. And that's the variation I'll be exploiting in order to tell you how much the exports of construction services between Poland and Germany changes when taxes differentials between those two countries changes by X%. That's the way you should think about it.
Mathilde, if I work for a consultancy, if I'm a German and I work for a consultancy and I have a client in Portugal and I go down on site for 2 months, is that inside or outside the scope of your analysis?
It is going to be inside my scope, but that's not going to be a large part in terms of quantitatively of those flows, but this is going to be in this scope. Yes.
And that's because the trade and services is dominated by the blue collar work. So the consultants are not an important part of that sector.
Exactly. It's just that it's fully liberalized, so you could have a ton of consultants that are doing this, but effectively in Europe today, most of the services are traded through blue-collar workers rather than consultants.
Thank you.
All right, so that's a very good transition for me to give you what is the broad framework of these trading services I'm going to be talking about and what is exactly the intersection between trade, migration, and taxes. So the type of trading services I'll be studying today is called mode for supply of services by the World Trade Organization, or posting by the European Commission. So this posting means that firms located in any country A can send freely employees to any country B in order to supply services locally. So workers are formally employed in country A, but they actually supply a service in B's territory. And the tax and regulation treatment of those workers are set in trade agreements. So those posting flows are simultaneously a trade and a migration flow, which means that the one that I'm going to be talking today is both about how tax policy can shape international mobility of employees, but also how tax policy can shape trading services and comparative advantages in countries in those type of sectors. So I focus here in this paper on international flows, but those estimates may matter for within country as well. Between tax and regulations can differ widely within country, if you think, for instance, about the US, and can in turn shape where suppliers of services are going to locate within a given country between states that have very different level of taxes on labor or minimum wages, for instance. So the precise policy I'll be exploiting today is called the European Posting Policy. It exists since 1959 for all European member states, And it means that firms do not have any licensing or entry authorization restrictions in order to send their employees abroad to supply some services. Importantly, what the European posting policy says is that social security contributions for the workers that are temporarily sent abroad to supply some services should be paid in the origin country rather than in the destination country. So in a way, if you're Poland and you export TVs or if you export construction services, the level of social security contribution or taxes you pay on your workers that produce those services or goods is exactly the same. So it's not the case that if you send your workers to Germany, you are going to have to pay the social security contributions that are German, not Polish. However, what the policy says as well is that the minimum legal wage in the destination country should apply to those flows. So unlike export of goods, I actually need to comply with destination level requirements in terms of minimum wage. And this, and I will explain this in the model, this kind of rule creates some bilateral variation in the cost faced by firms when they export services that is really similar to what firms face when they actually need to pay some bilateral trade tariffs. And so Europe is a very good laboratory to study those trade migration responses to taxes for mostly three reasons. The first one is that this European posting policy is actually the oldest and most liberal trade migration scheme in the world. So what I document in my job market paper is that posting represents roughly 20% of European trading services, and it's twice larger than standard immigration. So it's a large way to trade services, but also to trade people in the European Union. And so the fact that this scheme is very large, but also liberalized, means that what I will be estimating today is probably an upper bound for international trade migration responses to taxes compared to what could happen elsewhere in the world, where those schemes perhaps were less liberalized or smallest in terms of size. The second very interesting features of this policy is that it allows me to obtain exhaustive data on trade migration flows for a very long time period. So here, I'll be using EU-wide administrative forms to track posted workers, which means that unlike standard papers on trading services, I'll be able to measure in a very fine and good way bilateral trading services between countries. The last interesting feature of the policy is that it creates very rich variations in tax policy and regulations that apply to bilateral trading services through posting. So while it is usually very hard to measure ad valorem measures of tariffs on services, because actually you do not have trade tariffs on services, you have some changes in regulation, some entry restrictions, some licensing restriction, and so on, it is very hard to convert those restrictions into monetary costs. What I'm going to be able to do in these papers is to actually use the minimum wage and tax variation that apply to posted workers in order to obtain some tariff equivalent of costs for trading services, which will then in turn allow me to estimate what is the trade elasticity of services with respect to cost. So in terms of data, as I was saying before, what is really nice about the European setting is that we actually have very good data on the social security information on all workers that are sent abroad to supply services locally through the posting policy. So I'll use the universe of European social security forms that have been issued by all European countries for all posting missions performed in the EU, which will allow me to construct what is called the gravity data set by trade economists, so I can observe all bilateral posting flows between all European countries for a long period. But rather than being identified through custom data, my data set is going to be identified through social security information on workers that are sent abroad by their company. In addition, I'll also use in the paper additional national posting registries in some member states, which will contain information on sectors, which will allow me in turn to study specific preferential regimes that have been implemented within countries on some posted workers. So basically what happens, and I'll explain that later, is that some workers sent abroad to supply services have been facing different tax rules depending on which type of sectors they were working in. And so I will use those additional posting registries to identify which workers have been treated by the reform in order to exploit this variation in my estimation. And so I'll merge those information on bilateral trading services for posted workers with exhaustive collected data on wages, payroll taxes, and minimum wages in order to use exhaustive variations in the cost to supply services across countries through the use of the posting policy. All right. So if that's clear, let me move to the theoretical framework that will help us to understand what is exactly the variation that is created by the policy and what is going to be the parameter we are going to be estimating and what does it mean for policy implications. So in order to do so, what I do in the paper is to use a standard trade model where you have a continuum of countries and of services that can be traded. And basically the idea is that firms, in order to supply a service from one country to another, face a unit cost to send workers abroad. So here, origin country are I, destination countries are G's. And the cost for a firm that is located in a given country to supply services in another country is basically the combination of three components. The first component is the gross labor cost that you face for hiring one worker that is going to supply service in any other destination country. This gross labor cost is itself composed by three components. First, you have the level of wages that is in the equilibrium wages in the origin country. So if I'm a firm located in Poland, I face some wage W to hire a worker in the Polish labor market. No, not only I need to give W to my Polish worker, I also need to pay some taxes and additional regulatory costs in order to send this guy to perform services to Germany or to France. So because the posting policy says my level of taxes are set in Poland, not in the destination country, here the level of taxes is going to be TOY. So it's going to be related to the origin country where the firm is located. However, because the posting policy says I need to potentially face additional costs if I send a worker in a country where the destination level minimum legal wage is higher compared to my origin wage level W, I'll also have to pay some bilateral cost AIJ here. This is this
non-negative or
sorry?
That's non-negative or
it cannot be negative. So it can be, so if I send a worker from France to Poland, of course, the French minimum wage is higher than the minimum wage in Poland. So here this term is zero. However, as soon as I want to export services in a country where the minimum legal wage is higher than the equilibrium level of wages in my origin country, I actually need to suffer a cost that is positive, and that is depends on this kind of bilateral variation in the difference between minimum wages between two countries, basically. And so in a way, because this term is bilateral, it kind of mimics the effect of a trade tariff. So it does not cost the same for you if you're Poland to export services to Germany than to export services to Bulgaria, basically. All right. So in addition of this gross labor cost, I also face some mobility or trade costs of friction that is denoted by this bilateral term. So I need to pay for transport, perhaps I need to pay for some cultural distance or for some additional cost that I need to pay in order to send my workers abroad. And this may be constant within a given origin destination pair. And finally, these costs to supply. Yeah.
That's an iceberg cost. That's just lost.
Yes, exactly.
Okay.
So it's just something, it's kind of like for each unit of labor, each worker I send from kind of like Poland to France, I know there is this kind of epsilon in addition because this guy needs to travel or he needs to kind of work a bit more in order to like book the tickets and all of that. So that's the way you could think about it. And then the last term is the standard productivity term. So origin countries may be endowed randomly with different productivity in different type of services. And this matters in order to determine how much it costs for you to send your workers from one country to another in order to supply this service. So in a nutshell, this kind of simple equation shows you that the trade and tax policy parameters matter to determine the equilibrium level of trade and services between two countries. So what matters are two things. What are the rules you decide for social security contribution affiliation? So whether you decide that the Polish firms needs to pay the level of taxes in Poland or in Germany will in turn affect bilateral flows of services from Poland to Germany. And what matters is how much of the destination level taxes and regulation you want to apply to the exporting firm located in Poland. So if Germany decides to increase minimum wages or to expand minimum wages to other German regulation to the Polish firms, this will automatically increase bilateral costs of posting workers between Poland and Germany, and will in turn determine how much Poland and Germany trade in terms of services. So what I do is, it's quite standard in the trade literature. I then say that the productivity term is freshly distributed with some parametric assumption on the distribution of the productivity term, which allow me to express the equilibrium trade migration flows in perfect competition that is given by this equation to here. So here, this equation just tells you that how much Poland and Germany or any origin destination country trade is a combination again of three factors. It's the combination of this numerator term, here, how much it costs for a firm located in A to send workers in country J to export services. It is a function also of this denominator that we usually call the multilateral resistance term. So these terms captures not only how much it costs to send workers between Poland and Germany, but also how much it costs for any other competing countries apart from Poland to send workers to Germany. So in a way, this is kind of the indirect way where other countries' taxes are going to matter for bilateral export of services between Poland and Germany. And this last term is destination specific, is just the fixed demand of services in each destination country. And I'll try to control for those terms using some fixed effect in the estimation. All right. So this.
Could I ask another question, Mathilde?
Of course, of course.
Sorry, I'm just going back to your previous slide. So presumably some of these firms would have the choice of making a local hire as well. Does that present any sort of inequality or arbitrage condition that constrains the distribution of CIJs, or?
So here you mean a firm in Germany can decide to kind of have workers from Poland for the posting or to hire German workers? That's what you meant.
So if it's a Polish company, they can either send a Polish worker to Germany, or they can hire a German worker in Germany. Now, there would be, I mean, the usual way we would set the second one up is that they sink the fixed cost for setting up a subsidiary in Germany, but then they would compete in Germany as if they were a German company.
Yeah. So here you're thinking more about the kind of substitution between, okay, I'm this firm in this origin country, and I can actually either stay here and have only the trade or the mobility friction, or I could actually, instead of sending workers, I can kind of send my capital. So I could set up a company in this country, hire people there, and then kind of doing the service there. So I think the way this model talks to that is by making this assumption that any firm in Germany could actually be a Polish firm that is just open in Germany. Mm-hmm. So I guess here the difference would be whether you think that the firm, if a Polish firm opens up in Germany, whether the productivity term is actually the productivity of Germany rather than Poland. So in my model, the way you could think about that is by thinking that a Polish firm that opens up an establishment in Germany will face the gross labor cost in Germany. So this would be the same. And then the productivity term would be in Germany. But then if you want to think about a model where I can actually take some of my productivity term with me, opening up an establishment, you need a different model.
Yeah, I'd wondered whether that would allow you to pin things down more precisely, if you can constrain things by more inequalities. I mean, that's a very naive, off the top of my head thought. Okay, good, thank you.
Okay, that's a good point. All right, but in this very standard word, as we were saying, simplifying assumption, a simple gravity model kind of exemplify what is the structural parameter we want to estimate and what are the kind of identifying variation we can exploit to identify this parameter. So basically, this model predicts how international tax rules should shape trade in services. So what it tells you is that, I'm sorry, I'm still going to be using export from Poland to Germany just to make it clearer. It tells you that export of services from Poland to Germany should be increasing in the level of taxes in Germany. So the higher taxes on German local workers the more competitive are Polish firms to supply workers in Germany. Those export of services between Poland and Germany should be decreasing in the level of taxes in Poland. So when Poland increases level of taxation on Polish workers, Polish firms become less competitive in supplying their services to Germany. And then it tells you that those bilateral export of services between Poland and Germany should also be decreasing in these bilateral terms AYGT. So basically, whenever Germany increases its minimum legal wage, it's actually increased the cost for Polish firms to supply services to Germany, and it should decrease competitiveness of Polish firms in the German labor market. So in a way, here, changing your minimum legal wage in a destination country or expanding the amount of regulation you want to apply to posted workers or to those foreign workers hired by foreign firms acts like an import tariff. So if I'm Germany and I say all of a sudden, I think it's not the minimum legal wage, it's the minimum wage in the collective agreement that should apply to the workers of suppliers of services that are sent in my territory, I'm actually doing the same thing in the model than when I say the TV I import from China should actually be X% more expensive. So that's what the model tells you. And the model also tells you that there is this kind of theta parameters, that is what I call the elasticity of trade migration flows with respect to cost, that identifies two things at the same time. It identifies some behavioral responses to taxes, because it tells you how the international mobility of employees changes when you change tax differentials, but it also identifies trade responsiveness to cost that may be very useful to calibrate some trade and spatial models. So how much geography of services or export of services change when I actually change the way I tax firms and workers across space. All right. So what I try to do is to exploit shocks in those red and blue parameters here in the equation in two successive steps. I'll start by showing you some quasi-natural experiments. So where I will kind of use those exogenous shocks in country-specific reforms that have changed either level of taxation or level of bilateral posting allowance firms need to pay. And those quasi-natural experiments would be very useful because they will allow us to inspect pre-trends and to provide clear reduced form graphical evidence of whether bilateral export of services are affected by international rules on labor taxation. And then I'll take this exactly this equation to the data by providing some theory-based estimates of theta using all cost variations in all the data. And then I'll try to show you that the results I get from quasi-natural experiments and theory-based estimation are very close, which tend to suggest I am actually not so bad at approximating the value of this elasticity of trade migration flows with respect to cost. All right. So if that's okay, let me move to the first bunch of results. And before moving to quasi-natural variation or shocks in tax rates, I just want to start by showing you the steady state relationship between posting, so export of services from Mumbai people, and differences in terms of taxes between European countries. So here, this is a bin scatter plot, but basically in the data set, one point is that the origin destination level. And so for a given origin and destination level, I observe the level of export of services for posted workers, and I can export the differences between destination and origin level of taxes on labor. So all the differences in terms of labor costs that are not due to wages, but due to differences in the kind of tax schedule. And so what I show in this graph is that there is this kind of striking positive correlation in the steady state between how much countries trade services for posted workers and the gap in terms of taxes on labor. So the higher the level of taxes in the destination country compared to the origin country, the more I import workers, I import services through the posting policy. But of course, this kind of correlation with a coefficient of 0.5 could be driven by many other factors that are not necessarily this is not necessarily saying that this is the impact of tax differentials on posting. It could be just unobserved characteristics of countries that are correlated with both the amount of posting and the level of taxes in a given country. So in order to get to a more causal estimate of this elasticity, I'll move to some country-specific tax reforms. I do that for 4 reforms in the paper, but I'll start with the 2 main ones here in this slide. So here, I kind of try to exploit 2 big country-specific tax reforms that have been implemented in 1 big destination, so 1 big importing country and 1 big exporting country. So my laboratory for the importing country is going to be Belgium in blue, and the laboratory for the exporting country is going to be Slovenia in red. And so those 2 countries changed massively their level of taxes on labor, one in 2015, one in 2013. So Belgium, yes.
You're calling these the exogenous shocks, is that right?
Yeah.
Why are they exogenous in this case? I mean, I could imagine that there would be some discussion about what effect these were going to have on their ability to send workers abroad, or
yeah. So those are going to be in particular for the Belgium one. So the Belgium one is going to be kind of a nationwide reform. So it's not going to be specifically linked to posting itself. So the assumption would be, well, it was kind of determined by some nationwide discussion on, oh, we want to tax labor and so on, and not so much on the kind of particular segment of importing services for posted workers.
Okay, so just would I paraphrase that by saying that the posting is a relatively small component of the overall policy, and as a result, the determinants of the overall policy are going to be fairly orthogonal to. Yeah. Okay, fairly insensitive to the posting issues.
For Belgium, at least, yes, because it is very important in some sectors, but in terms of entire workforce or entire, in a way, the share of posted workers in national employment is roughly around 3% in Belgium. So it's not like it's going to be a massive share. For Slovenia, the reform is going to be targeting on posted workers. So here it's going to be more difficult to claim whether it is exogenous or not. So that's why I'm always going to be showing some pre-trends. So I'm always going to be showing some pre-trends in order to see whether there were preceding changes in posting flows before that the tax reform is implemented, in order to understand whether those tax cuts are actually implemented in response to some differential trends in postings. And then, so those are the 2 first tax reform. Then I have 2 more. I hope I may have the time to show you where
Can I try and ask a quick follow-up question?
Yeah. This
is the sort of question that I'm going to identify myself as living in the UK now. So having left the European Union, are there any, tell me which countries in your data set do not use the euro, but are nevertheless part of the European posting policy?
So sorry, can you say that again? What are the countries?
Countries in your data set that are not part of the euro, but nevertheless are part of the European posting policy.
Yeah, so all European member states are part of the European posting policy. So those would be like Poland, for instance, or like all those countries. So you can believe that in this kind of mobility friction term, you also have currency exchange rates, basically.
I see. I guess I was wondering whether you would have countries for whom currency shocks could count as exogenous shocks.
Yeah, I mean, I guess you could exploit that as well. So you could say, okay, no, the exchange rate between Poland and France changes in a kind of, perhaps not exogenous, but at least orthogonal to posting.
Sure.
And then it will change what is the value of the French minimum wage for me, and then I could use that as an instrument. But then I will have, I guess, to focus on those kind of specific countries first. But
I should let you continue. Thank you.
No worries. But then just following up on the exogeneity, then I'll also try to exploit within country variation in tax rates that have been determined by the European Commission, so not by the country itself. And then it's really nice because first, this is a European regulation, so you cannot kind of act on it. And second, because it's also within country, I can actually have destination and origin year fixed effect that will control for kind of overall shocks that can occur in a destination and origin country that are not probably linked to the change in labor costs. Okay, so Belgium decreased its labor taxes, social security contribution rate by 7 percentage points in 2015, while Slovenia decreased it by 10 percentage points in 2030. So for each of these reforms, I'll try to build a control group that is built in a symmetric way in kind of 2 approaches. The first approach is going to be using as a control group some neighboring country that seems to be similar in terms of either import or export of posting flows composition and in terms of overall institutional shocks that have been affecting those countries. So for Belgium, it's going to be France that imports kind of the same type of, in terms of amount and in terms of sectoral composition postings than Belgium. And for Slovenia, the control group is going to be other new member state that entered in the EU with Slovenia, but that did not change massively their level of social security contribution. However, in order to have some more data-driven way to build a control group, I'll also build some control group using the synthetic control method that will just match each of these kind of treated country with another country that did not change its kind of tax rate on labor and that was following similar evolution in terms of other kind of covariates. And so for both of the reforms, I'll use the exact same estimation methodology. I'll try to compare postings to or from the treated versus the control country before and after that the large tax cut is implemented. And so the prediction is that the decrease in tax rate in the destination country should decrease the imports of postings relative to the control group, while the decrease in the level of taxes in the origin country should actually boost the competitiveness of this country and increase the exports of trade in services compared to the other control countries that did not decrease the labor taxes. All right, so this is kind of the first stage. So all the labor tax evolution evolves between the treatment and the control group before and after the reform, using as a control country the neighboring approach, so either France or the new member states. So you see here the large decrease in social security contribution in Slovenia compared to other Eastern European countries, and simultaneously the large decrease in the level of taxes in Belgium here, while it stays the same, at least during the first years in France. All right, and this is now, how does it translate in terms of evolution to imports and exports of services through posting in both of those countries? So on the left, you see that while imports of services through posted workers in Belgium and France was following very similar trends from 2008 to 2015, as soon as Belgium decreases massively the level of taxes on domestic workers, you see that imports of services in the Belgian labor market through posted workers starts to differentially decrease compared to the level of import of services in France, where the level of taxation did not decrease that much. Simultaneously, when you focus on Slovenia, the origin country, you see that export of services from Slovenia from other new member state was also following close trends between 2009 and 2012. And as soon as Slovenia decreases massively for its companies the cost to supply services through this kind of labor tax cut, export of services from Slovenian companies starts to increase dramatically differentially compared to the export of services from other new member states that stayed actually quite stable over the same period. And so, interestingly, while the two experiments focus on different country pairs with different type of variation, the elasticities that I estimate are qualitatively and quantitatively very similar in terms of magnitude. So it's around 3.1 for the Belgian experiment and around 2.3 for the Slovenian experiment. The reason why it's opposite sign is because the variation is in opposite direction. And so using the synthetic control method as well as a kind of out of sample and robustness effect of this experiment, you see that the estimated elasticity is again quite close, with an estimate that is around 2 now for the Belgian tax sheet and around 2.3 for the Slovenian posted bonus. All right. So I think those graphs started by evidencing some trade migration responses to countrywide tax cuts, with a difference in difference reduced from estimate of the elasticity that is above 1, so between 2 and 3. However, and that's what Colin was discussing before, those estimates can actually be contaminated by some country level shocks that are simultaneous to the trade reforms that we cannot be filtering out. So for instance, if Belgium decides to change tax rates in response to some shocks that occur the same years, and that is likely to also affect the import of services through posted workers afterwards, well, even the difference in different analysis is not going to be able to capture for this kind of simultaneous shock. And so that's why trade economists are so obsessed with controlling with exporter year or importer year fixed effect in order to really get some fine variation in the level of cost variation without having to be contaminated by some general equilibrium effects. In order to tackle this issue, I'll try to be a bit more precise and to not exploit within country cost variation that have been created by the policy. So I do that with two reforms in the paper, but for the sake of presentation today, I don't have the time to show it, so I'll just focus on one. And so the reform I'll focus on today is an increase in the level of taxes paid by companies located in Luxembourg in some sectors. So let me explain what is the reform. The reform is actually not implemented at the country level, it's implemented at the European level. So in 2010, the European Union changed the tax rules for export of services through posted workers. And so basically what the European regulation said is that workers posted, so sent to their own country of residence. So meaning if I am a firm, I am located in Poland, but I am actually sending a French worker to France, I am actually not able to pay the level of taxes in Poland. I need to pay the level of taxes in France. So for those workers, the kind of too high becomes staging, basically. So you move from having a red component to a blue component, you become affiliated to the destination level social security contribution organization. In addition, workers with no prior affiliation in the origin country should also pay the level of taxes in the destination country, not the origin country. So similarly, if I am a company located in Poland and I want to hire someone that has never paid its taxes in Poland to any other country, I cannot do so. So I cannot hire some foreigner that I hire from Poland in order to send him to France. If I do that, I need to pay the level of taxes in France, not Poland. So those kind of two reforms were meant to constrain the amount of tax arbitrage that were available to firms in order when they were exporting services to other countries. And so what we see in the data is that roughly 80% of the flows that have been affected by those reforms are actually in the temporary employment agency sector only, because the structure of the trade in services that was done by temporary employment agencies was actually more vulnerable to these changes in the tax rule affiliation. So what I try to do in order to understand the effect of this reform is to use granular data on all exports of services through posting from Luxembourg, which allow me to identify in a very precise way posting in the ex-post sector, the temporary employment agency sectors, with very granular information on citizenship and first social security contribution affiliation in order to check exposure of firms and workers to this large European regulation change in 2010. All right, so first, again, the first stage of the reform, this is what it looks like for firms located in Luxembourg that used to export services through posted workers in the temporary employment sector compared to other sectors. So you see that starting in 2010, after that the European regulation is implemented, when you are a temporary employment agency and that you send workers abroad to supply services, you actually see a very important increase in your average gross labor cost, because all of a sudden you get affiliated to the destination level taxes rather than keeping your level of taxes at home. And Luxembourg is known to have very low level of taxes on labor compared to the countries where it exports services to. In contrast, if you are either a firm in another country that sends workers abroad, or if you're a temporary employment agency located in Luxembourg, but supplying services locally, not abroad, your level of taxes stay the same, the one it was before. That's basically the type of variation that is created by the European regulation. And so that's what happened in the Luxembourg labor market in terms of export of posting services in the temporary employment agency after that the European regulation changed tax affiliation. So you see that, so here I am comparing the amount of services supplied locally, so in Luxembourg, or supplied abroad by sending workers through the length of the posting policy, before and after that it becomes very expensive for firms located in Luxembourg to send temporary employment workers abroad. So what we see is that before the months of the implementation of the reform, the rate of increase in services supplied domestically or abroad was really similar between 2006 and 2009. But as soon as it is very costly for you to actually send workers abroad in order to supply some temporary employment agency services abroad, we see that the amount of services exported by temporary employment agencies located in Luxembourg starts to decrease dramatically compared to what happened in terms of services supplied domestically. And so the resulting elasticity that I can estimate with, again, a reduced form difference in difference methodology is around 1.3 and is statistically significant at the 1% level. So in a way, when I estimate this elasticity, I am able to kind of include those year fixed effects that here are going to be common to both services supplied locally or abroad for the same origin country. So you can think about this fixed effect as actually filtering any shocks that can occur in the Luxembourg temporary employment agency labor market, only exploiting the differential variation in cost between supplying services domestically or abroad. However, you may be concerned that there is something very specific about export of services from Luxembourg to other countries that may actually drive this huge decrease in the export of services from temporary employment agencies located in Luxembourg that are kind of orthogonal to the changes in tax rules that have been implemented by the European regulation. So in order to check that, I'm going to run this kind of placebo exercise where now I'm going to kind of adopt the exact same approach, but focusing on a controlled sector, that is construction, that was not affected by the European regulation because most of the structure of the trade in services between Luxembourg construction firms and other countries were not affected by those kind of 2 bullet points that the European regulation had in order to change labor tax regulation for some specific type of export of services. And what you see in this control sector that is not directly affected by the change in regulation in 2010 is that you do not have any differential evolution in the number of services supplied domestically or abroad before and after the change in European regulation in the treated sector, not the control sector, with an elasticity estimated that is very close to 0. All right. So I tried to show you in 3 different types of country level experiments that it seems that changing tax rates and international tax rules on trade in services seems to have a very significant impact on the trade in services flows and trade migration flows between one country and another, with a reduced form elasticity that ranges between 1.3 and 3 for the upper bound of my estimate. So what I try to do in the last part of the paper is now move to a more general approach, trying to pull all variation in payroll taxes and minimum wages in order to estimate the model I've shown you in the first part of the presentation. So here I'm back to my kind of equilibrium condition for posting flows. Again, bilateral posting flows between one country and the other in a given year is a combination of gross labor cost and mobility friction and some terms that vary in the exporting and importing country. So here, I'll try to estimate precisely this equation using all variations in posting flows in all my data sets and all variation in cost. So I think this has this kind of very nice feature that helps me to estimate somehow a lot of sample tests for the sectoral level experiments studied before. So typically, I'll estimate this equation at the national level, and therefore I won't be accounting for some specific tax schemes that have been implemented at the sectoral level, because when I have my kind of data set aggregated at the bilateral level with no information on sectors, I am actually not able to measure precisely what is the cost variation between two countries. So if any, the fact that I kind of try to test the estimate of this elasticity in this kind of Europe-wide data set will be biased by some measurement error, because there are some specific tax breaks, like the Luxembourg one variation, that I'm not taking into account with this estimation strategy. So if any, we may expect the estimate of the elasticity in this specification to be lower than the one I obtained in the reduced form analysis. So here, when estimating this equation, I'll try to follow the rule of thumb for structural estimates of gravity equation that is usually used by trade economists. So I will use both log linear and Poisson pseudo-maximum likelihood estimators. I'll include per fixed effect at the origin and destination level so that I am able to control for permanent characteristics that matter for bilateral trading services, such as distance or cultural proximity. I'll include, of course, internal trade migration flow, so internal posting flow. So not only how much imports of services from Germany to Poland, or import of services of Germany from Poland, but also how much Germany imports its own domestic services, so that I have the margin of choosing, as you were saying, between Polish services or German services. And then, because I have those nice variations at the bilateral level, I will be able to control for origin year fixed effects. So that means that I will be exploiting variation in, destination year fixed effect. That's the first, this brilliant point here. So when I have a destination year fixed effect, that means that for a given destination country, say Germany, I'll exploit differences in level of origin taxes and bilateral posting allowances within a given destination. So given all the labor market shocks that happen in Germany in a given year, well, perhaps Slovenian posted workers are cheaper compared to French posted workers, because level of taxes vary in a different way in Slovenia compared to France. And then I'll also be able to include some origin year. So this is not, so that's a typo. That should be the same, but only with a high. So origin year fixed effect, where here, within a given destination origin country, you may have some cost variation because the posting allowance you must pay is actually different. So for instance, that means that for a given shock in Slovenia and for a given shock in Germany, the level of posting allowance that needs to be paid from Slovenia to Germany or from France to Germany is different, because the variation in the minimum wage in Germany does not affect Slovenia and France in a similar way. So that's where the bilateral variation in the cost is coming from. All right. So I'm always almost out of time. So that's the 2 remaining minutes are perfect for me to show you the estimates of this equation implementing this strategy. This is what I try to show you in this table, where I pull all variation and all data on bilateral posting flows together. What you see here is that the elasticity of posting flows with respect to bilateral cost using those approaches ranges from 2.4 to 0.9, so almost 1, with a median estimate of 1.1. So this is actually quite close to the estimates I've been showing you in Luxembourg. We're trying to control for origin year and destination year fixed effect for this kind of within country variation. So this last column is the one with the red box. Why? Because this is the specification where I control simultaneously for destination year fixed effect and origin year fixed effect, meaning that I am controlling for any simultaneous shocks that could be correlated with export of services and other kind of tax policy that could be implemented in the country. And so this kind of median estimate is smaller than what I've shown you on average in country level experiment, and means that on average, increasing the level of taxes by 1% in a given exporting country decreases export of services from that country by roughly 1.1%. So there is a large elasticity of posting flows or export of services with respect to cost. But this elasticity I estimate here, which is what I show you in pink, is actually much smaller than what people have been estimating for standard trade in goods. So this is what I show you on the right of this graph, where I take some median point estimates from meta-analysis in the literature, looking at trade in goods responsiveness to change in trade tariffs. So it seems that trade in services, at least in the context of the European posting policy, is much less responsive to trade in costs compared to standard trade in goods flows. However, what it also means is that this trade elasticity, that is also a migration elasticity that I estimate in this paper, is actually a bit bigger in terms of magnitude compared to international migration responses to taxes that have been estimated by public finance in the literature. So in a way, this means that services may be less responsive, so less elastic compared to goods when they respond to costs, but international mobility of people, when intermediated by trade in services, seems to be a bit more responsive to taxes. All right, so let me just conclude. I try to show you today that tax competition matters for the geography of services and the geography of mobility of workers, with an elasticity of trade migration that ranges from 1.1 to 3. So enforcing, using this kind of estimates, I calibrate in the paper that enforcing tax cooperation in current European tax treaties would decrease posting by roughly 30%. So I think those estimates may be of interest for many recent talks on standards in trade agreements in terms of labor or environment clauses. So how would kind of the geography of economic activity in the world change when we want to implement some additional costs driven by environmental clauses or labor clauses? I think these elasticities are very relevant elasticities to use in order to calibrate some models to understand what would be the effects of such policy. But they also speak to the new challenges for tax and labor market policy. So when location of formal and actual employment differ across space, like in the posting policy, the way you set tax rules matter. And I've showed you that if you allow taxes to differ between country of formal employment and country where the service is actually supplied, you may actually shape massively the geography of economic activity across space. Thank you so much.
Thanks a lot, Mathilde. So are there any questions from the audience so that we can discuss? Recording is still on, so I mean, please, please pose your questions. If there are any. I don't see kind of questions from the audience. Maybe you can just answer my question because I'm thinking about kind of applied side of this story. And for instance, if I take my country, specifically Ukraine, if the government would like to increase, the employment, including through the kind of firms and posting, as you were describing in your paper, what should be the policy of the government in terms of taxation, labor taxation? What would you advise to the government, Ukrainian government? And this is really kind of acute question because after the war we have to rehabilitate and we have to revive, and that's a very difficult question for us. So maybe you can advise a little bit on that.
Okay, so well, I think what I can tell from this paper is that it is clear that the way you set labor market regulation and tax rules matter for how competitive you are in the international market to supply services and goods. So basically what I'm trying to say here is that some countries that may initially have some comparative advantage in services, for instance, because they have a lot of workers or they are very good in construction services and so forth, well, actually, the more they decrease their taxes, the more competitive they become just because their level of taxes and labor costs is just smaller compared to elsewhere. So in a way, what I've shown you is that you can increase your market shares in services probably by being cheaper because of tax competition. But that does not mean I would advise tax competition, because it may be just a short run effect, right? So you're going to be in some given years, you're going to be more competitive because you kind of levy less taxes compared to others. But then we also know that having some redistribution, having high level of taxes, and then spending these to increase kind of long-term investment and so forth also have some long-term effects for growth. So you kind of, as a government, and that's not something I try to address in this paper. This paper is mostly about saying something like, the way we think about trade is actually not trying to think about what part of trade flows are not driven by differences in productivity, but pure tax arbitrage, or the fact that firms can just locate in places where labor is just treated poorly compared to others. And in my calibration, 30% of those flows of trade in services through posting are actually just, the consequences of having very stark tax differences that apply between countries because of some institutional rules. And then I think that's only one side of the story. So if you're the Ukrainian government, you think, oh, one side of the story is that actually if I do some bigger time neighbor policy and I say, oh, all my firms that will send workers abroad to build some houses in France and in Poland, I will give them a tax break of 30% so that they are super productive. That's kind of like an export subsidy that should be in theory forbidden in the European Union, but it's not yet. But then you also need to think about what's the impact for me of having less tax revenue. So either you want to redistribute within Ukraine and you think firms providing construction services, need to receive more compared to others, and you think it's fair to decrease taxes on those firms compared to other actors in the economy. Or you kind of want to decrease your tax revenue in the long run, and then you need to think about the long run productivity effect of not having that much redistribution. So I would not recommend the Ukrainian government to engage into tax competition to increase export of services. I would, I think, encourage to push for some trade liberalization in service. So that's kind of related to my first paper, where I show that it is true that for some countries, and I think that's true for Ukraine as well, that when you are specialized in services, those type of policies are very good for you because they allow you to expand your market shares in sectors that tend to be protected from international trade. So if you're not that good at producing, milk, but you are at producing construction services, this is actually very nice because you can engage in the gains from globalization by expanding the range of traded services. The only thing from those policies is that they kind of make the distinction between what is fair and unfair competition very narrow. And then I think what is good is to try to make sure we keep those kind of gains from globalization for those sending countries that may be very good at supplying services without having this kind of tax competition effect that may also be very bad for workers, by the way. So you kind of like need to find a good balance.
Great, thank you. We have to stop recording, right, Colin, here, or we might, I don't know. Are there any questions probably from the audience? Otherwise, we stop recording and probably continue discussing afterwards, or finish up. It looks like there are no questions. So maybe this is really a time to thanks a lot to Mathilde for really great presentation, lots of insights to take away from this seminar. So yeah, thanks a lot, Mathilde. Thanks a lot, Colin, for organizing that. And
thank you for the invitation and sending all my thoughts, and hoping things are